Good morning. I want to invite you to join us as we read from the book of 2 Corinthians this morning. Today we will be reading 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 10 through 24. I'll read the passage and then finish by saying, "This is the word of the Lord," and you can respond by saying, "Thanks be to God." 2 Corinthians chapter 8, starting in verse 10. "And in this matter I give my judgment. This benefits you who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also to desire to do it. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. For if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and burdened, and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. As it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. But thanks be to God who put into the heart of Titus the same earnest care I have for you. For he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he is going to you out of his own accord. With him we are sending the brother who is famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel. And not only that, but he has been appointed by the churches to travel with us as we carry out this act of grace that is being ministered by us, for the glory of the Lord himself, for the glory of the Lord himself, and to show our goodwill. We take this course so that no one should blame us about this generous gift that is being administered by us, for we aim at what is honorable not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. And with them we are sending our brother, whom we have often tested and found earnest in many matters, but who is now more earnest than ever because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for your benefit. And as for our brothers, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. So give proof before the churches of your love and of our boasting about you to these men." This is the word of the Lord.
I went to a Christian college, and they had a small campus in Israel, just west of Jerusalem. And so I got to do a study abroad semester there. And our professors would sometimes, day by day, they would take us to different locations. And usually we didn't know where we were going, or if we did, I didn't pay attention when they said that. So we would just drive somewhere, we'd end up somewhere, and we'd be in an ancient ruin, or we'd be in an underground tunnel, or wherever, and they would start to teach us about this place. But one day our teachers wanted us to get a good panorama of the central plateau of Israel. And so they took us on a long drive up this pretty large hill, and we stopped the bus and we got out and we found ourselves walking through an unfinished structure. And different than the structures we had been in for most of the trip, this was a modern building. It was a modern building, not an ancient one, and it kind of reminded me of like a train station or something like that. It was very high ceilings, but it was this two-story building, and it was obviously supposed to be a very large structure. And it had graffiti and all these things all over it. And our professor started to tell us the story of this place. He told us this place was supposed to be a grand palace that displayed the wealth of the Jordan royal family, the royal family of the nation of Jordan. And in the mid-1960s, King Hussein of Jordan, he started this construction of what was going to be this grand summer retreat atop this hill near Jerusalem. And the palace was this display of his power. It had a kind of a 360 view of the surrounding area. And it was meant to show that the Jordanian government was in control of the eastern region of Jerusalem. However, the Six-Day War started in 1967, and it led to a changing of all these boundaries, right? And so as there was this kind of orchestrated attack on Israel, Israel fought back and took all of this land. The palace was never finished. It was left there as a monument to failed aspirations And to this day, the Israeli government, for some reason, has not allowed walls to be put around it or gates or anything. They leave it open so anyone can go in there and can see this palace that never was. And how many stories in history are just like this one, where somebody has a great plan, they want to do something amazing, and they start on the journey, but they just can't finish it? There's so many stories like this. The desire for something great is not followed through with wise action. And I often think of that unfinished palace when I think about the works that we undertake as Christians. How I don't want to have works that are like that I start with good intentions, but I can't finish. And generosity can be the same way. We can start off and think, yes, I'm going to do this great thing. I'm going to commit my life to giving in this way. We have a sincere desire, but we don't always follow through. We don't complete what we set out to do. And so it's crucial that we seek to finish what we have started. And last week we discussed the heart behind generous giving. But now the Apostle Paul in this section, he's going to challenge us to follow through on our intentions and to begin living a generous life. So last week we saw the first part of chapter 8 as Paul transitioned topics in this 8th chapter. He begins to talk about the importance of giving. And again, we're going to see that theme in chapter 8 and chapter 9 of this book of 2 Corinthians. So we're calling this series in these two chapters Abundance by Sacrifice, as we see that God's promises to give them, the Corinthian church, what they need to be able to fulfill his mission for them. And in the same way, I think we can bank on that promise from God that he's going to give us what we need to do the work he's laid out for us. And what we saw last week is that this first section of chapter 8 is that sacrifice is fundamental to Christianity. And so Paul calls us first to have the right heart in our generosity. That as we sacrifice for others, whether it's through our finances, through our time, through our energy, that God is going to be building up his kingdom through our sacrifice. And generosity, we saw, isn't about how much money you have. It's about the heart behind what you give. It's about the sacrifice that you're making on behalf of others. And our sacrifice is a crucial piece of how God is going to build his kingdom. A kingdom where many people are brought together as one united people. And as we give to each other, as we sacrifice for each other, we display the beauty of the good news of Jesus. That he can unite us even as we were apart from each other and in enmity with God. But how can we make sure that we don't just desire to be generous, we actually give, and we give in the right way, a joyful and wise way? Well, Paul, he starts this section in verse 10, and this is what he says. He says, "And in this matter I give my judgment. This benefits you, who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also to desire to do it. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have." So he commends them. He says, it's good that you began to willingly give to others. But he says here, you have to keep going in this task. You have to finish the work that you have started. Living a life of generosity or of sacrifice for others is not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing discipline. And there are many times where in the course of sacrificing for others, there will be a reason to stop doing that. But here Paul calls us to continue. He says we need to build habits in our lives that can shape and guide us, hopefully, if God gives us many more years to come, to continue to serve, continue to give, continue to sacrifice for others. So the Apostle Paul, he makes it very practical for us in this section. So we see first that he says, give according to what you have. So that's the first kind of command of this, is give according to what you have. Verse 12 is pretty direct. He says, for the readiness is there. It is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. So the wording here might be a little bit confusing. Often the translation can be a little bit, literal here. But what he's saying is pretty simple. He's saying God accepts our giving according to what we actually have to give. God's not looking for you to make a gift that is far more than what you could possibly give. He's honored when we give according to our ability. So as he blesses us, we then, in turn, give of what he's given to us, and this honors God. God doesn't expect us to give more than we're able to give. He simply wants us to be generous with the resources entrusted to us. And this is important because often we think, well, once I get to this stage of life, when I have this kind of income, then I'll start giving to others. And when we do that, it's amazing how when you get to that target, your viewpoint is very different. And you understand now that not only do you have more income, but you actually have more expenses. There's more things to plan for in the future. There's more needs around you. And so it's easy to then say, no, I can't give. When I get to this higher level, then I'll start giving to God. But no, God calls us to give based upon what we have wherever we start. So this leads to an important question, which is, what amount of my income should I give to God? And a lot of us, I think we want real clarity on that. Okay, what is the exact amount that I can give to God? The problem is that in the New Testament, there is no sermon on the amount. And so, that's an amazing pun, by the way. I just want to say, that was amazing. I didn't even make that up, I stole it. But before we answer this question, we will answer this question, I think we have to, but we first have to remember, okay, that there's something more crucial than asking how much. It's more crucial to ask why. Why is it that Paul is making such a big deal of this offering in this passage? Now, I think part of it is just Paul wants to develop in the hearts of the Corinthian church, and I think by extension our hearts as well, a spirit of generosity. Absolutely. There's an actual need that's occurring in this Jerusalem church that the Corinthian church, many, many miles away, can actually supply for them. So there's a tangible need that he wants to meet. But I think beyond that, the Apostle Paul, he's always looking at things in a very big picture. He's always looking at the meaning behind these things. And I think what's happening here is that Paul is actually saying to them that they can display the unity of the gospel in the way that they give to other people. They can display that God has brought together people that were very different into one body. And in this specific instance, it's Jews and Gentiles, the Jerusalem church and the Corinthian church, that can actually mutually give to each other and display that God is bigger than those cultural or ethnic differences. God is calling the Corinthian church, even as they've been blessed with the gospel that came from Jerusalem, delivered to them by Jews like the Apostle Paul, that they can now give back in a material way to benefit and to bless the people who have given them this message. And so for Paul, there's a display of real unity together. Our generosity is about far more than just meeting people's needs. It's about displaying God's plan for the nations. It's about telling people of His glory. And as we give generously, we live out the message that we preach. So often our giving, especially for us in the position that we are as a nation, where we have on average so much more than other nations, that we can actually bless people that we will never even meet. We can serve people that we will never have a relationship with. Why? Because we believe what's written here. We believe that God cares about those people and has a plan for those people. And so we give to others as we are able. So before we answer the question of how much, we have to understand, is this something that we should be eager to join in? We shouldn't just ask the question in terms of how can I give as little as possible. But how much is a fair question? In the Old Testament, tithing was the standard. So that word tithe is kind of an old-fashioned word that means a tenth of your income. So they would take a tenth of their income and they would give it to the ministry work in the temple. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than this because there were actually 3 different tithes, and one of those tithes was a tri-annual sort of a tithe. So it really kind of came out to about 23% of your annual income that was going to the work of the temple. But more than that, the thing about these tithes was that they funded the temple, but also originally the government of Israel was a theocracy. So these funds are also going, in a sense, to fund the government of Israel as well. And then, of course, when the Old Covenant is fulfilled in Jesus Christ, we're no longer under the old system that was put into place under Moses. And it's interesting, we don't see explicit command after Christ to tithe. Instead, as we see laid out here in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, the command that we see over and over again is to give generously, to give sacrificially, but there's not a specific percentage attached to that. So, does that mean then that we should just give whatever we want? Maybe, but there's one complicating factor in the argument, which is that tithing didn't technically start under the Mosaic law. Tithing actually started under Abraham. Abraham was the first one to tithe. Now, if you're not familiar with Abraham, he is the father of the Jewish people. So his story comes in the very beginning, 500 years before Moses. And the story of Abraham has some interesting contours to it. One of those is that Abraham tithes to a man named Melchizedek. So keep a bookmark in 2 Corinthians 8, but go to Genesis 14 if you can. Genesis is the first book in the Bible, so it should be somewhat easy to find. And what we see in Genesis 14 in this story is that Abraham, who's at this point called Abram, has been raided by these foreign nations. There's been this war that's been going on between different kings, and Abraham was caught in the middle of it. And then Abram and his small band of warriors goes after those who had taken all these spoils, and he conquers them, takes back the spoils, takes back the slaves, all these things, and he brings them back to the kings who originally had those possessions. But on his way, as he's delivering the spoils of war back to those that it was taken from, he comes across a mysterious figure named Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is later spoken of in the New Testament in Hebrews chapter 7 as having some interesting connections and prefiguring, really, Jesus Christ himself. So he's an interesting character. And this is what we see in Genesis 14, verse 18. Excuse me. It says, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. So in order to honor this great figure, Melchizedek, Abram actually gives him 1/10 of what he has. Now, of course, a lot of what he has doesn't rightly belong to him. It belongs to those he had, that had been taken from and that he had rescued it back. But legally speaking, those were then his possessions. So he gives as a way to honor God and to give generously to him. He gives to this priest that kind of represents God. So what do we learn from the story of Abraham giving a tithe? Why is this significant for us? Well, it seems that this is a standard type of gift to God that precedes the Old Covenant. So there's a standard in some sense that's been set, and therefore I think there's good reason to see this type of giving as a standard after the Old Covenant as well. I'm not going to be dogmatic about this. I'm not going to say that you have to give at this amount, but I think we can see this is sort of a baseline or a guideline for God's people throughout history. But our perspective on our giving shouldn't be just the flat amount that we're giving. It should be the sacrifice we're making out of the ways that God has blessed us. So that's why it's important to think, I think, in terms of I'm giving a portion of what I receive and not just a flat amount, right? So someone could give a few dollars and make a massive sacrifice because God hasn't given them much. Another person could give millions and actually not be giving that much because God has given them billions of dollars. I think we should view our dollars in that way. Okay, how do I give a portion of what I have according to my ability? In the same way, I think we should view our time that way. Some of us, we might actually make more money, be able to give more of that, but we don't have very much time. For others, it's the opposite, right? We call those who have lots of time but little money, we call those college students. And so maybe you say, I have a brutal work schedule, I drive over the hill every day, or I have newborn babies, or I'm pursuing a degree that requires a ton of time. I know a friend who was a medical student, and it was just all the time for him. And it was really, really hard for him to even serve for half an hour, to give of his time. And so whatever it is that you're able to give, whether of energy or time or money, God knows that, and he sees your giving according to your ability, and that honors him. Don't compare yourself to others. So we give according to what we have, and God is honored with that. And again, I think kind of a baseline standard, a good place to start is giving a tithe of your income, although that's not, in my opinion, commanded in the New Testament. So we give according to what we have. Second, we give to pursue fairness. So go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. So he says in verse 13, he says, For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that is a matter of fairness. So he's saying, I'm not saying that you need to take on this great burden so others can just kick back and have it easy. We shouldn't view life and finances in that way, that others work hard so others can sit around and do nothing. What he's speaking of here is this word fairness. That word fairness in verse 13 is a key word. It's going to repeat it. It's the idea of justice in the way we deal with our money, or really the word can just mean equality. There's a desire to make sure that everyone has equality in the sense of everyone's needs are accounted for. Not in the sense that everyone has the exact same amount. So what does this word fairness mean? It makes me think, actually, when I think of fair in regards to money, I always think of a certain politician who used to talk about how, millionaires need to pay their fair share, until he became a millionaire. And then he said, billionaires need to pay their fair share. And he dropped talking about millionaires. But let's be clear, the Bible is not talking about socialism or communism. In fact, the Bible really, is against these political philosophies. Marxist beliefs were the greatest opponent to Christianity in the 20th century, and they still are very much alive today. I had a professor once who pointed out that these Marxist philosophies, in their purest forms, actually violate pretty much all of the Ten Commandments. True socialism, true communism in its purest form, it breaks the commandment, thou shalt not steal. Because that command of stealing implies that personal property exists. So to deny personal property is a formula for stealing whatever you want. Socialism and communism break honor your father and mother because so often the state seeks to replace the family as the center of society. Or you shall have no other gods before me. The state often sets itself up as God. That's what we've seen over and over again. Or thou shalt not murder. These communist states tend to slaughter people in huge numbers. In fact, we often hear about religious wars. The deaths under communism and Marxist governments in the last 100 years far surpass all religious wars combined. And of course, they violate, most of all, you shall not covet, because the foundation of the philosophy is really desire for the possessions of somebody else. People feel entitled to someone else's wealth or property, and therefore they covet. Now, the Bible doesn't endorse that sort of pure form of socialism or communism. And we should also, I think, be very suspicious, very wary of the watered-down versions we see today. Now, we should never have the posture of just taking from others because we want what they have, or thinking that because someone else is wealthy, we should have what they have. Listen to 2 Thessalonians 3:10. Paul says, "For even when we were with you, we would give you this command, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. For we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but busybodies. Now such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living." Paul is saying, if you are able to work, then you should be working. You should be providing not just for yourself, but for others. Of course, there are exceptions in the Bible for those who are not able to work. Of course. But we should want to work. We should want to provide as much as we can for others. So what does Paul mean by fairness here? He's simply saying that there will be times when you experience abundance. God gives you more than you need, and so you can provide for the needs of others. Look, he builds on this thought in the next verse, actually. He really expounds on what fairness means in verse 14. He says, "Your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness." So he uses that word fairness again here at the end. So he's kind of explaining what he means. As you have more than you need, you should be supplying for others. And then when they have more than they need, they can supply for you if you're lacking. That's the beauty of how God provides to us in different seasons of our lives. Now notice a few things that are important. Notice this isn't coerced. This is voluntary giving. So again, this undermines those political systems that would say we have to forcefully redistribute the wealth. No, but we should have a posture to say, if there's someone in my community, especially in my church, that has a need, I would love to find a way to meet that need voluntarily. And notice this is about meeting needs, not enabling laziness. Again, we see the same kind of thing in Acts chapter 2, where they're selling their property, they're giving money to each other, but listen to the language. It says, Acts 2:44, And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. They're giving because they're in a desperate season where some have enough to provide for others. So generosity is about meeting the needs of those around us, and this doesn't exclude the reality that some will have more than others. They'll have bigger houses, things like that. No, what it does mean is that we should take it as our personal responsibility that no one in our church should have a true need that is unmet. Galatians 6:10 says, "So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially those who are of the household of faith." So we take care of each other. That's one of the best ways to do it because we know those around us. We know their character. We know what their needs are. And notice this is tied into the bigger picture again. This isn't just about fairness in the sense of having enough to make ends meet. This is about recognizing as Gentiles, most of us here are Gentiles, that means non-Jews, that we owe it to others before us that we even have the gospel, and therefore we give out of this heart of gratitude. In this case, they have a chance to actually give to the saints in Jerusalem and to display the unity God has created in Jesus Christ. Verse 15, he goes on to give a text to support this. He says, "As it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack." He's quoting here from Exodus chapter 16. I won't make you turn there, but in Exodus 16, there's an interesting story, which is it's in between the giving of the law in Exodus 19 and 20 and the delivery from Egypt. Right? So people have come out of Egypt in this Exodus. About 1 million people traveling on foot to Mount Sinai and then to the Promised Land, and God has to provide food for them. And so the way that he does it is he provides bread from heaven called manna. So these flakes would come down, they would land on the ground at night like dew, and then the people would come out and they would gather as much as they needed, and they had a measurement for each person. They would make bread from it, and God said, whatever you have left over, don't keep it. Right? Get rid of it. And then the next day, God will provide again and again and again. And those who gathered too much, it rotted. Right? Worms grew in it. It was nasty. And so what God was teaching them was he's going to provide for them day by day. He'll provide just enough for that day. And then the next day, he'll do the same thing again. And so it says in that story, right, whoever gathered much, right, had enough, and whoever gathered little had enough. Everyone ended up having exactly what they needed. And this was, as God would say later in Deuteronomy, this was a teaching that they don't live by bread alone. They live by the words that come from the mouth of God. God is the one who provides for our needs. So how does this connect to our generosity? Well, God provided for everyone through a gift from heaven above. And now he does that same provision through giving us more than enough so we can give to those who are in need. In other words, God isn't giving bread directly from heaven. He's giving it through the hands of his people. That we can give as there's a need around us. And one of the reasons why I've been excited to be in this section with you is because I know that that GCC is going to need provision from God, financial provision from God, to continue to do the ministry that God has given to us. Right? As a church, we have a lot of missionaries that we provide for outside of our context and also within, right, at UCSC. A lot of you give to those missionaries. Our staff here at the church depend entirely on what comes into the church. And it's been interesting for me. I spent 9 years doing youth ministry, and so on staff at a church, and then all of a sudden I am the senior pastor of a church for 6 years, and I see things from a different perspective because of the seat that I'm in. And I don't have a problem saying to you that I believe in this church and that I would ask you to give to this church generously because I see the way that the finances of our church are directly connected to the mission that we're doing and to the people that are on staff here. I see that, right? That the money that we have is going to directly affect how we're able to raise up staff and keep good people on our team for the long run. It's going to enable us to do different outreaches. It's going to allow us to do awesome ministries in this area. All of ministry does take those finances. So I'd encourage you to consider, as God has blessed you, what you can in turn give to the ministry here as well. And I would ask you, if you're a member here, if you're part of the family here, make this church the primary place where you invest your kingdom resources in order to see the gospel go out here in Santa Cruz. So we've seen that giving should be according to what you have, that giving should be about pursuing fairness, right? Giving out of our abundance. And then third, giving should be well stewarded. Giving has to be guarded. There has to be accountability measures in place to make sure that abuses don't happen. So what Paul does in the last part of this passage is he tells them of 3 men who are coming to gather this gift and to bring it to Jerusalem. So first he mentions Titus in verses 16 and 17. That's the first guy he mentions. Now we saw this Titus mentioned earlier as the guy who went by Paul to check in on this church. Right? There's a book in the Bible named after Titus. And so he's trusted by them. Second, he says there's this famous brother he mentions who's famous for preaching the gospel. And he's mentioned in verse 18. And we don't know who this is for sure. Some traditions say that this is Luke, the doctor, who wrote the book of Luke and the book of Acts. He was a traveling companion of Paul. But we see in verse 19 that he's actually been appointed by the churches. So Paul has picked Titus, and the church picked someone that was trustworthy in handling finances. And then third, we see in verse 22, he also sends the faithful brother. This faithful brother who, again, we don't know who this is. So why is Paul sending these 3 men to take care of the finances? Well, he says in verse 20, he says, we take this course so that no one should blame us about this generous gift that is being administered by us. For we aim at what is honorable not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. Paul says here this money was a generous gift. That means it was a large sum of money that they were handling. And he's concerned that this won't be mishandled, not just for the sake of the saints in Jerusalem, but really for the sake of the integrity of Paul's ministry. He's concerned about his reputation in one of the areas where a person is prone to have accusations and actually have real misconduct is in the area of finances. You know, it's crucial for us that we have accountability in every area of life, but it's true especially as we handle money that's been given by people to the work that God is doing. When you're handling somebody else's money, there has to be good accountability. And this is the approach that we take here in regards to finances, right? We have processes in place. We put these in place on day 1 to make sure that we had a certain number of people handling money at any given time so there wasn't an opportunity for something inappropriate. You always have to have at least 2 unrelated people, right? Not a husband and a wife or something like that. 2 different people, different families that are handling it together to check each other's work. So on Sunday, you may not know this, but when money is given by someone on Sunday, it's taken and it's counted by at least 2 people. They count it, right? They have a form they fill out that says, here's the amount of money. Then it's handed off by someone to deposit. And of course, they then check that. And then when it's deposited in the bank, we can see if it matches up with the number on the paper. And if it doesn't, then we start waterboarding those 3 people until we figure out, no, you can go too far, I guess. But no, it's very important that we understand and say, okay, are we handling God's money well? We have an outside accounting firm that does our bookkeeping, our payroll, and our bills, all of that, and amazing volunteers at the church that handle that stuff. So I'm thankful none of that is ever handled by me. It's amazing, right? You will never see me collecting money on Sunday or writing checks on behalf of the church. And accountability with money matters a ton. It matters a ton. Remember, Judas, before he betrayed Jesus, he was stealing from Jesus. He was taking money out of the offering for himself. The worst crime in history was birthed out of a greedy heart that took advantage of other people's generosity to benefit himself. And the reason why I don't want to touch money is not because I'm tempted to steal, right? I have plenty of temptations and sins that I'm prone to. That's not one of them, thank God. But it's just simply to have a barrier so I don't have to deal with those things or potentially face accusations. The reason why we do that, right, is because the job of handling God's word is first and foremost. So we want to keep that away from other things that could complicate it. In your own personal life, there are ways that you may be tempted to mishandle money as well. And I would encourage you to think about this, not just in terms of the organization, but in terms of your own personal life. Where are areas where you're prone to take advantage? Maybe as an employee, you don't work all your hours. Or you're technically working, you're on the clock, but you're not working as you should. You're taking advantage of a lack of accountability and taking advantage of the person who's paying you. Or maybe you take things from your business that you shouldn't. Or maybe the company you work for is engaging in underhanded practices and you haven't said anything. Or when it comes to filing your taxes, which is going to happen soon, right? You fudge the numbers. You don't report everything, and there's a good excuse for it. The government just wastes our money anyway, right? But we use that as an excuse to be dishonest. That's not okay. Or we take advantage of programs designed for the needy that you don't really need. Having integrity in your finances says so much about our hearts, and we shouldn't minimize the importance of it. And then notice the final thing that Paul says here about these men. In verse 23, he says, "As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for your benefit. And as for our brothers," meaning the brothers delivering the money, "they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. So give proof before the churches of your love and of our boasting about you to these men." One interesting phrase here is that phrase at the end of verse 23, the glory of Christ. Who does that apply to? It could actually apply to two different things in the Greek. It could apply to the church, meaning the church is the glory of Christ, but a lot of commentators think it actually applies to the messengers, these men who were delivering this gift and having integrity in their dealing with money, that they were actually referred to as the glory of Christ. Meaning that those who steward resources well and handle God's money well are a picture to him of God's own character. They reflect the glory of Christ. So our generosity, it matters greatly. It should be given in joy, it should be given in wisdom, and it should be stewarded well, because our giving is a sign of our unity in Christ. It's a picture of what Christ has done for us on display for everyone to see. That we would sacrifice together to further God's mission, to reach people around the world we've never even met in many cases, that shows what Christ has done for us. Or that we would sacrifice for the needs of the people around us, that shows that God has changed us, that we're no longer a bunch of individuals, but we're a community of faith, united in Jesus. What does your generosity reflect to others about the good news of Jesus? I know for myself, and I'm sure for many of us, this study is going to be a real challenging thing. God's going to be maturing us over the coming weeks. So I hope we'll be praying together through the prayer guide, and we'll be taking seriously, asking ourselves the tough questions, that the world needs what we have, and so we should be generous and give together. Let's pray.